Alright guys, welcome back to Steve's View. Today we're diving into one of the wildest turns in the Russia-Ukraine war diplomacy drama. If you've been following my channel for a while, you probably remember a video I did a few days ago where I talked about Trump's peace push, that big White House summit that was supposed to bring the war in Ukraine closer to an end. Back then, I was cautiously optimistic. I said, hey, this might be a breakthrough. This could be the moment where we finally see some serious steps toward peace. But, and I made this point clearly, I also warned that Vladimir Putin and his government have a long history of breaking promises, twisting words, and playing games. They've got this reputation for, let's just say it bluntly, acting like bullies who don't stick to their own commitments. So while I was cautiously hopeful, I also said, don't be surprised if Moscow pulls the rug out from under everyone. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happened. And now, according to a pretty explosive Reuters report that dropped yesterday, what looked like a peace breakthrough has turned into what I can only describe as a full-on diplomatic farce. Some people are calling it a trap, others are calling it a fiasco, and honestly, after reading the details, diplomatic farce sounds about right. So let's break down what happened, why this whole thing matters, and what it tells us about Trump's approach to the Russia-Ukraine war. So let's rewind a little bit. Last Monday, Trump made a big splash by hosting what he called a peace coordination summit at the White House. The whole thing was built up as a major step toward ending the war in Ukraine. Why did Trump suddenly decide to roll out the red carpet and make all this noise? Well, it turns out the spark came from his envoy, Steve Witkoff, who had just returned from Moscow. On August 6th, Witkoff met with Putin, and after that meeting, he rushed back to Washington with what he called a huge breakthrough. According to him, Putin was ready to make a major territorial concession in order to end the war. And you can imagine how that sounded in the White House. If the Russian president was finally ready to back off, that would have been massive news. Trump was thrilled. European leaders were thrilled. Everyone thought this might actually be the moment. And that's why Trump pushed so hard for the White House summit. He wanted to seize the momentum. Now here's the kicker. What exactly was this major concession that Putin was supposedly offering? According to Witkoff, Putin was ready to withdraw Russian forces from two regions in southern Ukraine, Zaporizhia and Kherson. In exchange, Ukraine would give up its claims to Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. On paper, that looked like a swap. Russia gives back some territory in the south, Ukraine cedes some in the east. Some analysts even said, from a numbers perspective, Putin is giving up more land than he's getting. That's why this was described as a serious compromise, maybe the first real sign that Moscow was willing to step back. So Witkoff delivered this to Trump. Trump praised him for making tremendous progress. And the White House quickly started talking about a historic summit with Putin. European leaders were contacted. Everyone started buzzing, and for a hot second, it looked like diplomacy might actually work. But then, less than 48 hours later, everything collapsed. On August 7th, Witkoff held calls with several European leaders, repeating the claim that Putin was ready to trade southern Ukraine for the eastern territories. Leaders in Europe were encouraged, even excited, and then on August 8th, literally the very next day, Witkoff suddenly walked it all back. He told US and European officials, actually, Putin never said he would return the southern regions. There is no such territorial swap. Wait, what? Instead, he said Putin's position was basically, Ukraine must cede Donetsk and Luhansk, period. The only thing Russia would give up in return was a handful of small villages in northern Ukraine that they had recently seized. Not two whole regions, not even close, just a few villages. So, in the space of 2 days, story went from Putin is ready to make a historic concession to Putin wants to keep everything and only trade a few villages. So in the space of 2 days, the story went from Putin is ready to make a historic concession to Putin wants to keep everything and only trade a few villages. You can imagine the reaction. European officials were stunned. They pressed Witkoff. You kept saying Putin was talking about a territorial swap. So what exactly is he offering in return for Donetsk and Luhansk? And that's when the truth came out. The so-called swap was basically a sham. Putin hadn't promised to give up anything substantial. So here's where Reuters comes in. Their reporters did a deep dive on all of this and came to a pretty damning conclusion. They don't believe Witkoff simply misunderstood or miscommunicated what Putin said. Because think about it, confusing 2 whole regions in the south with a couple of villages in the north, that's not a minor slip-up. That's not a translation issue. That's a totally different scale. Reuters argues that this was deliberate. Putin intentionally dangled the idea of a territorial swap, made it sound bigger than it was, and let Witkoff carry that message back to Washington and European capitals. Then, once everyone was already excited, the rug was pulled out. In other words, the whole thing was a setup, a trap designed by Putin to make Trump look naive and overeager. And honestly, if that's the case, it worked. Think about the optics here. Trump staged this massive peace summit at the White House, hoping to be the guy who finally brings an end to the Ukraine war. For a moment, he looked like the deal-maker again, the guy who could cut through the noise and make history. But then, it turned out the entire premise of the summit was based on bad information that Putin seems to have fed deliberately. Instead of a breakthrough, Trump ended up with a fiasco. Instead of being the architect of peace, he looked like he got played. And Trump's response showed just how frustrated he was. He lashed out at Russia, threatening very severe sanctions if Moscow didn't move toward a ceasefire. But the damage was done. The White House summit went from being celebrated as a bold step toward peace to being remembered as a diplomatic farce. And let's not forget the deeper policy problems here. Trump proposed a security guarantee plan for Ukraine that would put Europeans in the lead role, with the U.S. playing a supporting part. Russia completely rejected it. Moscow's counter-proposal was basically no foreign troops in Ukraine, not American, not European. If there's going to be a security framework, Russia itself has to be part of it. And they even floated the idea of bringing in China. That's not a peace plan. That's a poison pill. So when you add all that up, Trump's initiative didn't just fail. It collapsed under the weight of false promises and Russian obstruction. Now here's where it gets interesting. Kurt Volker, Trump's former envoy to Ukraine, has a much more optimistic take. He told Reuters that in the long run, Trump will be forced to put more pressure on Russia. Through tougher sanctions and stronger military support for Ukraine, Volker even quoted that famous line about America, that the U.S. always tries every wrong option before finally doing the right thing. He's basically saying Trump gave Putin plenty of chances, but now that those chances have blown up, the only option left is to get tough. It's a nice thought, but is it realistic? Some analysts, and honestly, I'm leaning this way too, think Volker is being way too optimistic. Because if you look at the political landscape, especially voices around Trump, like J.D. Vance, there's not much appetite for escalating against Russia. They don't seem furious about being misled. They don't sound like they're ready to double down on sanctions or military aid. So while Volker is saying, don't worry, Trump will eventually make the right choice, others are warning, this might be one of those exceptions where America doesn't correct course. So where does that leave us? First, I want to connect this back to something I said in a previous video. When that White House summit was first announced, I said I was cautiously optimistic, but also deeply skeptical because of Putin's track record. And sure enough, that skepticism turned out to be well-founded. What looked like a breakthrough was really just smoke and mirrors. Putin played the game, fed the bait, and let Trump run with it until the truth came out. This isn't just about one bad meeting or one confused envoy. It's about a pattern. Russia has repeatedly used deception, half-promises, and shifting narratives to manipulate the diplomatic playing field. And if U.S. leaders keep falling for it, we are going to see this movie over and over again. So yes, in my view, this was a diplomatic farce. A high-profile stunt built on a lie, ending with everyone looking foolish. But it's also a wake-up call. If Trump really wants to lead on Ukraine, he can't just rely on Putin's word. He has to be willing to put real pressure on Moscow and back it up with action. Otherwise, the deal of the century is never going to happen. So to sum it up, Trump's big White House summit was based on what looked like a major concession from Putin. That concession turned out to be basically fake. Reuters argues it wasn't a mistake, but a trap set by Putin. Trump ended up embarrassed, threatening sanctions, but still without a clear path forward. And while some experts believe he'll eventually get tougher, there's no guarantee of that. And remember, this is exactly why in earlier videos I warned against being too trusting of Putin. The Russian government has a long record of breaking promises and bending the truth, and once again, they've lived up to that reputation. What do you guys think? Was this a simple miscommunication, or did Putin deliberately set Trump up? And do you think Trump will learn from this and get tougher, or is he going to keep chasing a deal that's never really there? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more updates, and share this video with anyone following the Russian-Ukraine war. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.